Most of you have seen and heard the stories of the Holocaust. It was a living hell for 6 years. I've lived in this wonderful country for 50 years now. My life and my family members' lives have been strongly influenced by the war. It was not with me all the time anymore, but today is Yom HaShoah, and it is fitting I should speak about my past. I was born in a town called Kalisz in Poland, which was near the Polish-German border. The population was about 120,000, of which 30,000 were Jews. The population was very poor. The Jewish culture was abundant. We had Jewish theater, Jewish soccer teams, and many religious and Zionist organizations. I was born into a family with 5 children. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. I was the youngest. My father was a kosher butcher, and my mother was a today's woman. It seems that everybody was always asking for her advice. Every day my father woke me at 6. Then we went to the daily services at the nearby shtibul, and then Cheder or Hebrew school until 7. Then we would have supper and homework and to bed. I shared a bed with one brother. My sisters shared a bed on the other side of the room. The first 2 years I had trouble in public school. The Polish boys were always calling me Żyd, Żyd. You killed Jesus. It was especially bad the day after Easter. The priests would get the population riled up against the Jews. We learned not to go to school that day because it was a sure beating for all of us. Later we got a Jewish public school and things were better. The high schools were all private and my parents couldn't afford to send me. I went to work in a printing shop, making 3 zlotys a week, and went to school at night. When I was a teenager, the Balfour Declaration was signed. Its goal was for England to help build a Jewish state. I worked for a Zionist organization for 8 years. I've lived at a kibbutz near my house for 1.5 years. During that time, I sat at a table with Ben-Gurion and discussed politics during his visit to our kibbutz. We donated our funds to Keren Hamet, which bought land in Palestine with the hopes that Jews would be able to settle there. My 89-year-old brother Leon lives today in a house that is leased from that organization in Ramat Gan. In 1936, we began to have lots of problems with the hoodlums in our town. Gangs would beat us up. The police looked the other way. In 1938, I was drafted into the Polish army. I was put into the artillery, though I had never ridden a horse. I was miserable. I could not get the hang of mounting a horse without stirrups. I had to practice every night in the stables until I finally got the hang of it. When Passover came, I sneaked away and went to the Seder at my parents' house. On my return, I got caught by my Jewish sergeant. In September 1st, 1939, the war broke out. During one of the first bombardments, I found myself buried up to my neck. A bomb had exploded very near to me. Luckily, someone saw me and pulled me out. We were overrun and captured fairly quickly, and we were taken to Germany as POWs to Stalag 2A. We worked on a farm for 1 year, still wearing Polish army uniforms. At the end of 1940, an order came to separate all the Jewish soldiers and send them back to Poland. After 3 days on a cattle train, we ended up in Lublin. There, the Germans opened up a camp. They took our army uniforms and gave us rags to wear. We were now 12,000 Jewish civilians. We were guarded by the teenaged folk Deutschen. These were Polish boys who were prisoners and were put above us. They believed that they would get special treatment by the Germans. They beat us, but they enjoyed it. I was working in a stone quarry for a month. The order came to send us to the direction of Warsaw. I figured that it was to the Warsaw ghetto, and I knew that would be bad. I jumped a train before we got there and got caught by the SS. They beat the hell out of me and put me on another train to Warsaw. I jumped the train again. I made my way to a little Polish town, Łowicz. I got there at 9 p.m., but there were no Jews on the street because of a curfew. I did find a Jewish family that took me in for 2 days. I took off my Jewish star. I found my parents and grandparents in Tulishkov. We shared the house with the local police. We worked in the public schools for a loaf of bread a day. They separated the men who could work and sent us away to another site to build rivers by hand. That would be the last time I ever saw my parents or grandparents. They then separated the men and the women. My grandfather was shot and killed as he chased after my grandmother. My mother was taken away as well and confined in a church for weeks with no food and no toilet facilities. My brother Bernard found out where she was and got the job of carrying out the bodies as the people died. He saw Mother there and planned to smuggle her out between the dead bodies. A problem was that even as she was starving, she was still a beautiful woman and had pink cheeks. They rubbed the slime of human waste from the floor onto her face to darken it in order to camouflage her face. Bernard also saw my grandmother, but was not able to rescue her. It did not matter. The living, including my mother, were too weak to walk. They were carried off in the early crematoria on the way to the death camps Chelmno. You see, the Germans had developed portable gas chambers to put on the back of trucks, and there they both died. My beautiful sisters met the same fate. My father faithfully followed his beloved rabbi and ended up at the crematorium in Chelmno. The food at the work camp was awful. A little soup every day and a small piece of bread. The beatings were terrible. Some people broke out to the nearby village to beg for food. Every Sunday, the people that were caught were hung in the woods. The living were forced to witness the hangings. Half of our group died from hunger or typhus. I caught a severe case of the fever from typhus. Unbelievably, an uncle of mine who had some leather hidden was able to smear the German officials and got me into a German-run hospital. I got well. A few weeks later, I got the disease again and survived again. In July 1943, we were finally put on the dreaded cattle train to Respeecher, which became Germanized to the name Auschwitz. We arrived at midnight. A band was playing. We saw the now well-known sign saying Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. There were lots of SS men with dogs. They announced that those who could not walk should get on the trucks. Those trucks went directly to the crematorium. We lucky ones stayed up all night. We were stripped of our clothing and tattooed on the wrist. We were given striped uniforms and wooden shoes. The conditions were unspeakable. Beatings by the kapos, starvation. Up at 5 and standing in formation to be counted. A little black coffee, and work all day moving steel plates from one spot to another and back again. Sleep, if you could call it that, was in racks with inmates sandwiched like sardines. The stench was horrible. 200 meters away was the crematorium. Smoke was always in your eyes. We could see but not believe that this was a place where they burned people. Nothing grew there. No trees, no grass, no birds singing. When you got up in the morning, you would see people lying near the electrified fence, having committed suicide. 3 times I found myself in long lines facing 4 doctors. We would pass by the doctors, and as we passed, one would point left or right. To the left meant you would go straight to the crematorium. To the right meant that you would get to go through this again. One of the doctors I found was the Dibuk, Dr. Mengele. My job there was to work at the coal mine. Part of my job was to carry out dead workers who had been killed from falling rock. We carried the bodies on our shoulders. I was lucky that my job was elevator operator. Because of that, I was able to make the 4-hour marches each day to and from the barracks in the cold. During the marches, we were chained. This went on until January 1945. There was an air raid. Half of the inmates were killed. I was again very, very lucky to have survived. It was not much of a camp anymore. That same morning, the SS men got us together to begin the well-known death march toward Germany. The rations were closing in from the east. We marched for several weeks in the snow without food or sleep. Many walked barefooted or without much clothing. I had traded for, amazingly, a pair of boots and some schmatters that I wrapped around my waist. Each day I used part of the rags for dry socks. I let the other part dry for the next day. I had bribed the guards with some goods I had stolen from the canteen. If I had ever come across an honest guard, I would have been shot on the spot. During the march, hundreds of inmates walked away from the column and were shot. At one point, we passed by a farm, and the farmers had mercy on us. He cooked a bunch of potatoes for us. The SS man said that if he caught anyone going through the line twice, he would be shot on the spot. I went through the line 6 times. I thought that if I was going to die, at least it would be with a full stomach. You had to take your chances. By then, it didn't seem to matter too much. We came to a place called Gross Rosen. It was another concentration camp. We saw hundreds of dead lying in front of the barracks. Then we could hear the artillery behind us. We thought the end was near, but the Germans packed us in a cattle car filled with hundreds of us headed toward Berlin. During the 3-day trip, we endured a tremendous bombardment by the American Air Force. Again, unbelievably, our car did not get hit. We then arrived at Buchenwald. When they opened the cattle car door, half of the people were dead or near death. When we got to the camp, they said we were going to the showers. I was sure that it was the crematorium. Again, unbelievably, it was a real shower. The only reason that I can figure is that the Germans knew the end was near, and they were scared of repercussions. During our stay in Buchenwald, for our work, we were given wooden script worth a nickel. For that, we could get some soup. By this time, all of the prisoners had been pooled together. We had Russians, Gypsies, and various others. We had to sleep with our eyes open because some of the Russians would sneak up behind us and choke us for the nickel. By this time, we could hear the artillery again. Just a week before the liberation, they took 10,000 people a day into the woods and shot them. They called my number, 142857, several times. I said to myself, from here I will not move. I stayed under the barracks for 3 days and nights without food until Friday, April 11, 1945. At 11 a.m., I met the first American soldier. He gave me a piece of a chocolate bar. It was the happiest day of my life. The American army fed us. The first few days, hundreds died from overeating. Then the Red Cross came in and started feeding us properly. After the Potsdam Conference, we were given a choice of staying in East Germany or going with the Americans to West Germany. We settled in Landsberg, where we were taught to become people again. Thanks to the UNRA and the United Jewish Appeal, which was then called the Joint Distribution Committee, trade schools were opened, and we were able to start looking for family. Again, lucky me, I found my 2 brothers, Leon and Bernard. They joined me in Landsberg. I found that my brother Leon and I were in the same camp at the same time and didn't know it. Also in Landsberg, I met my lovely bride, Bluma. We married there. We had the joyous celebration of having a double wedding with Bluma's dearly departed sister, Sheila, and her husband, David, who is with us today. As most of you know, Sheila was critical to Bluma's survival in the war. Her loss is indescribable to Bruma and the family. Later, our first son, Henry, was born. We were settled in Colombia via New Orleans. My dream came true. I had all of the bread I wanted. We were lucky enough to be together with Selah and her family, and also our dearest friends, Den and Yatsia Stern. Together we learned the American ways and the language, sort of, and eventually prospered in this wonderful community. The Jewish and Gentile communities were wonderful to us. I think the American people are the greatest people in the world. Eventually, my son Carl and daughter Esther were born here, and with their spouses and our 7 grandchildren, we live a wonderful life together in Colombia. If you will allow me a few more minutes, I would like to quote from Mark Twain. He wrote, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world, in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?